oh dear, that somehow lost that. First of all, Singapore's performance in the PISA tests, and actually more recently in the survey for adult skills, has always placed Singapore as kind of unusually high up, especially for the adult skills of the younger half of the Singapore workforce. Secondly, taking a much longer historical perspective, Singapore has always stood out as a small city-state which has been very successful in matching the skills production with the skills demand at different stages of Singapore's development. And that's a characteristic that goes back for 30 or 40 years at least. And the third reason of interest is that there's been a significant change in the last 5 years or so in the skills policy and the approach to skills policy in Singapore. We've seen the development of a much greater emphasis on skills deepening and on lifelong learning in the SkillsFuture programs. And well, I won't be discussing those in great detail at the moment, but what it has meant, I believe, at least from the point of view of this particular presentation, is that there is, I think, a greater interest, a greater emphasis on university level or degree level education. So without further ado, let's get into some contextual facts. First of all, I'm going to look at the supply of graduate labour in Singapore, simply plotting the educational attainment of the residential labour force. Over the last decade or so, from 2009 to 2019, the proportion doing just post-secondary, non-tertiary education has kind of leveled off. There's a very small increase. Well, there is a tangible, but not a major increase in the proportion with diplomas and professional qualifications, kind of 2-year programs and so on. But the proportions with degrees has risen substantially from about 27% to nearly getting on for 40% by the end of that decade. So what we see there is that Singapore is very clearly participating in the massification of higher education, something which is ubiquitous across pretty well all countries and all regions of the world. And we see that that Singapore is not unique in that respect. I need to spend a little bit of time now talking about the concepts with which we're going to analyze the graduate labor market. And the first concept to talk about is the concept of the graduate job. Now, graduate job is a phrase which many people use, but my co-author, Golo Henziker, who is in the audience today and hopefully here to help answer questions, my co-author and I have done some work in the last 5 years trying to be clearer about what exactly graduate jobs mean. And essentially, from a conceptual point of view, the important thing about graduate jobs, I was going to read out a quotation for you. Just to read out this quotation to try and get it right, is a graduate job is one where a substantial proportion of the skills used are normally acquired in the course of higher education, including many of the activities surrounding it, and of its aftermath, that is to say the years after higher education, immediately after higher education, when skills are acquired in work through the graduate's acquired facility for learning skills. So it's quite general that, but the emphasis there is on the skills used in the jobs. And that's, that I think is fairly well understood by most people nowadays. but the controversy comes a bit later on when it comes to actually measuring what is a graduate job. I mean, can we make it into a useful concept? Can we measure it in a useful way that it actually helps us understand the way that the market works? I'll come back to the measurement a little bit later. So that's graduate jobs. And I suppose the one thing to say about what we found about graduate jobs is that there's a remarkable variation across countries in the use of graduate jobs. I mean, even countries at the same level of development, some countries will have maybe 10 percentage points more graduate jobs than others. And one of the main factors we found that explains why some countries use more graduate jobs than less is the quality of alternative skills supplies. So that, for example, a country like Germany, which has an extremely high quality apprenticeship system and high level apprenticeship system, actually has relatively few graduate jobs. And but other countries, say like, well, a lot of other countries have much more graduate jobs when they don't have alternative ways of supplying high skills. Okay, having defined a graduate job, then there is the next concept, which is underemployment. That is, if you are underemployed, if you are a graduate, but in a non-graduate job. If you're a graduate, not in a graduate job, then you are defined to be underemployed in this sense. Sometimes the phrase used is overeducated, but that has kind of pejorative tones, and some people don't like that phrase, overeducated. I prefer the term underemployed. And so we're going to call them underemployed graduates, or UGs, UGs for short, for the purposes of this paper. Now, the literature is now quite full on underemployment, and 2 or 3 things to say is that underemployment is not a temporary state. People who get underemployed tend to stay in their underemployed state for many years, if not permanently. Secondly, there is an identifiable pay penalty in every single country that we look at. And thirdly, there is a tendency, though this is not universal, there is a tendency for underemployed people to have less job satisfaction than graduates who are in graduate jobs. Who gets to be underemployed is another matter, and we will be coming to that later on. But in some countries, there is a tendency for women to be more likely to be underemployed, women graduates to be more likely underemployed than male graduates. And there's also a tendency in some countries, for example, there's a study in Australia, where migrant graduates tend to be more likely to be underemployed than resident graduates, citizen graduates. Okay, so that's me quickly summing up most of a fairly large literature. Now we come to the next distinction, which is new to this project. It's something which we found very useful to develop for this project, is we wanted to distinguish further between 2 types of graduate jobs: those which were warranted by the tasks involved, where we could measure the tasks, and those which were unwarranted. So some jobs are task warranted. That means that they're doing a lot of the observable tasks which we would expect graduates to be doing, and other jobs which are graduate jobs still, because they tell us that you need a degree to get the job, but nonetheless, they're not doing a lot of those observable graduate tasks. So we then predicted that there would be a difference between graduates, there will be a difference between the pay of people in task warranted jobs and the pay of people in task unwarranted jobs, because tasks are usually rewarded. So we now have, I haven't put it on this slide. We're going to call, actually the next, if you look at the next bullet point, we're going to call MUGs, matched but underutilized graduates. In other words, these are graduates, they're in graduate jobs, but they're not doing the sorts of observable tasks that we might expect them to be doing if they were graduates. Okay. So then the research questions that follow from that and from the literature are as follows. First of all, what is the state of the Singapore graduate labour market? Is the growth of graduates that we've already seen being matched by growth in graduate jobs? What's happening to underemployment in the country? Secondly, and complementary to those things about the quantities of jobs, what's happening to the wage premium for graduates, and what's happening to the penalties for being an underemployed graduate, or is there also a penalty for being a matched underemployed, a matched underutilized graduate? And finally, we're going to do a little bit on who gets to be underemployed in Singapore. The data we're going to use come from two surveys developed by the Institute for Adult Learning, the Skills Utilisation 2 survey, which was conducted in 2013, and the Skills and Learning Study 2017. These are two innovative surveys developed within Singapore because of Johnny Sung's and my long acquaintance. I think Johnny felt free to draw quite a lot on the British skills and employment surveys, but to develop questions specific to these surveys here. And I believe it's the case that these are only the precursors of further surveys to come in the future. Just to compare the two surveys, the 2013 survey was for 20 to 65-year-olds. The 2017 survey was for 20 to 70-year-olds. Therefore, when we put them together and want to do some harmonization and comparison, we just look for the 2017 survey, we just look at the 20 to 65-year-olds. You'll see that the 2017 survey is somewhat larger, but only 77% of them were in employment. Nonetheless, it's still a somewhat larger survey. They're still reasonably large social surveys. Both surveys were conducted face-to-face with on-site self-completion modules. The difference between the two surveys is the sampling method. The first survey used quota-based methods, and the second survey used the more desirable random probability methods. This has certain implications for the strength with which you can make statistical statements, and the comparison between the two, therefore, that difference has to be borne in mind as a limitation, as a qualification, if you like. But nonetheless, both surveys with appropriate weights succeeded in becoming representative of Singapore residents of the appropriate ages. Now we come to the measurement things. Quickly, I'll cover these. The key things are as follows. And I promise you this is the last slide before we get on to some interesting findings. The key things are as follows. First, how do we define a graduate job? We use the self-reported measure, which is widely used in other studies as well and has been validated in other studies as well. That is to say, we ask job holders what a new applicant to the job would be required to have. What level of qualification would they be required to have? And a graduate job is defined as if they say that they need a degree level qualification. So that's quite straightforward. The innovation we use in this paper is to deploy the measures of tasks which are required in the job. So we know lots of different tasks that are required in the job: literacy, numeracy, problem solving, communications, persuasion, whether the tasks are repetitive or not. I'm just listing a few off the top of my head. There are many, many more than that. And what we do is we use those tasks to estimate a model of the probability that the job requires a degree qualification. Having estimated that model, and we find that those, we find what you would expect in terms of the task requirements, that is to say, that the sorts of tasks that would be required to be used, like literacy, high levels of literacy, high levels of numeracy, high levels of persuasion, of professional communication, of planning, lots of those generic tasks involved in this model. We then use those task data to predict a graduate skill requirement score for each job. And then we look at all the graduate jobs, the jobs where a degree is required, and we classify them into task warranted jobs and task unwarranted jobs. And the task unwarranted graduate jobs we defined as jobs where there was less than a 30% probability of there being a graduate skill requirement. Okay, so a task unwarranted job would be like, in fact, it is a job where a degree is required, but the tasks would suggest that it shouldn't be. We make a 30% as the dividing line between task warranted and task unwarranted. You might say that's a little bit arbitrary, but we looked at variations, we did some robustness and sensitivity tests, and the findings I'm going to report are pretty well robust to those variations. So, apologies for going through those, but I think it was necessary to try to demystify the findings, which are now I'm going to cover. So the first big question is, what is the dynamic in the Singapore graduate labour market? So I'm just going to, first of all, put up what happened to the proportion of graduates in the job. And there we see the increase over that period from 32% to 38%. It's quite a big increase in the supply of graduates. Yeah. Within only a 4-year period, it's a very dynamic period of massification in the labour market. You might think, gosh, how is that going to be responded to by the labour market? Well, in fact, we see an almost identical or very similar increase in the proportion of graduate jobs between those 2 years, from nearly 29% to 38%. So one big finding from our project is there in that very straightforward diagram. Unlike most other East Asian countries, not all, we seem to see a really substantial growth in graduate jobs. It looks like to be that this period, before the pandemic, obviously, is a very dynamic period in Singapore's growth. But of course, I need to remind you the limitations that in terms of the comparison. This is only just 2 years we're looking at here. We hope to get more data later. It's only just 2 years. The next question then is, where does that growth in graduate jobs come from? Is it, as it were, justified and warranted by the tasks involved? Have the jobs in Singapore changed? Or is it just somehow that jobs which are unchanged, that somehow more people say that their jobs require a degree. Well, what we've done is to decompose that total growth in graduate jobs as follows. There in the blue is the growth in the proportion of graduate jobs. There is the proportion that is attributable to tasks. That's the amount of growth in graduate jobs which there ought to be, if you like, given the change in the tasks in their jobs. In other words, most of that is indeed task warranted. It didn't need to be that, didn't need to be that at all. And one might say, well, what about the task unwarranted? Is there any increase which is attributable to, not attributable to tasks and therefore somehow to kind of unobserved skills or whatever? And the answer is a very small amount. And in fact, that amount is statistically insignificant. So you could say that there's virtually no change in the amount of task unwarranted graduate jobs. Okay, so that's the amount of change in graduate jobs in relation to the graduate supply. What then happens to underemployment? Let's have a look at that here in this table. What we see here, and I'm going to just highlight, I'm not going to talk about all these numbers, but first of all, let's look at this column here, the proportion of graduates who are underemployed graduates. In 2013, it was 23%. 2017, a little bit less, but that's not going to be statistically significant. More or less the same, 21%. In other words, what we see there is a relatively low proportion of underemployed graduates, that is to say by international comparison. Some countries easily show something like a 30% figure here, but no tendency for this to increase. And that's not surprising because that in a way reflects the balanced growth that we saw in the previous slides. The second thing, the second thing to say about it when we look at this here is that the matched but underutilized graduates, the MUGs, to use my pejorative acronym there, the MUGs have gone from 20% down to 12.5%. So there are fewer, over this period, there are fewer graduates in graduate jobs which are not using these tasks. So that picture there, I think, kind of complements the previous story of showing a dynamic graduate labor market over these 4 years. The next big finding then now is going to turn to the hourly pay premium for graduates. And this is a fairly standard way of looking at graduates from an economist's point of view. You just compare the pay of graduates on average with the pay of people with lesser qualifications. And in this case, we're comparing it with people with school leaving qualification. Yes, at most secondary level qualifications. And what we see is, this is the log wage differential. It translates into something like a 200% pay premium. But interestingly, there's no change over this 4-year period. Different data sets showing pretty well exactly the same pay premium, reflecting to some extent the kind of regulated or pay for the job culture that goes in terms of in the Singapore labor market. Not much change there. A relatively large pay premium, no change over the period. But now let's get to something perhaps more original, which is to look at the pay gap or the pay penalty for underemployed graduates. That is about, can you see that, minus 0.35 there, minus looks like about minus 0.375 there. What that's saying is that there is quite a substantial pay penalty for graduates who are not in graduate jobs. Again, we shouldn't be too surprised about that. The new point of interest is what happens to graduates in graduate jobs, but their task unwarranted. And what we see there is that there is also a pay penalty, because these are all negative numbers. So there's a pay penalty. By 2017, that's as much as minus 0.2 log points. That'll be about 25%. There's a pay penalty, but it's not as big as it's not as bad as being in a non-graduate job, but there's still a penalty. Yeah. Okay, so moving on. We then wanted to know, well, given these pay penalties, what are the probabilities of being in a non-graduate job? What's the situation in Singapore? How's that compared to other countries? And we looked at 3 factors. First of all, comparing women with men, we find that there is a percentage point gap in that women are more likely to be in a non-graduate job, or less likely to be in a graduate job, by quite a considerable margin in Singapore. That parallels findings in some other countries, but that's by no means a universal finding. Secondly, we looked at migrants, those who are foreign born, not born in Singapore, and we found absolutely no difference between the pay, between the underemployment status of those graduates and the underemployment status of Singapore citizens. But interestingly, we did find a difference according to the socioeconomic background, as measured by whether parents had acquired a university education. And those people coming from a family where their parents had a university education were somewhat more likely to be in a matched graduate job. Okay, so those are those findings. So now, drawing to a conclusion, what we've found looking at these 2 surveys is a pretty successful story, I would say, pre-pandemic, that is. Or, of course, this is all pre-pandemic. And what can we conclude from it? My main conclusion is that it's something really important to monitor, because even though it's been dynamic and things have been matched so far, we saw from an early slide that there was a considerable rapid growth in the proportion of graduates in the Singapore labour force. We know from the difference between the participation in higher education of the young and older generation that we can expect that rise in the supply of graduates to be going on for a number of years. I mean, even if the government were to switch off the tap now, as it were, to sort of stop any further expansion of the Singapore universities, then there would still be an increase over time in the number of Singapore graduates. So that's easy to predict. It's hard to predict the graduate demand, however, because it's always difficult to predict graduate demand, the demand for graduate jobs, and it's, I think, particularly hard in the context of the pandemic. We have all sorts of economic forecasts for post-pandemic economic growth. But in addition, of course, that affects, in the case of Singapore, the extent of a migration of incoming graduate and non-graduate talent. So therefore, those factors, to my mind, all emphasize the need for continued monitoring of the graduate labour market. And I'd like to finish, however, with a few comments about the consequences of underemployment and underutilization. Okay, so we've seen there is a loss of pay, and we've seen from other countries that there's a loss of job satisfaction. But there is a danger that these kinds of analyses can lead to an excessively economistic interpretation of education. And we shouldn't forget that there are other benefits from education other than just the pay you get later on. And we know that even if you are underemployed, you do get some external benefits and some non-pay benefits from that education. We've seen that in other countries and earlier studies we've done. And we think that probably there is need for some further research in the Singapore context on these non-wage private benefits from higher education and on the external benefits from higher education, either for the pay of others or for things like health benefits. We know that more educated people are less prone to criminal behavior and so on and so forth. So those would be our two recommendations there. So continued monitoring of the match between supply and demand, but also to perhaps broaden things out to look at the non-pay benefits. Thank you very much. There are some further resources which go much further into the details, and I've been able to in this short presentation. They're listed here, and they will be available on the slides, which will be available on the website tomorrow. And I just finished with a thanks to the fruitful collaboration that we've had between our two organizations. And I'd like to express publicly my thanks to Johnny, who's not only facilitating today, but he's been an extremely useful bridge between our two institutions throughout this project and has provided a great deal of assistance, providing the data for us and advice on access and so on and so forth. So thank you very much, Johnny, and thank you, everybody. I'm very much looking forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. That was a very interesting presentation and exciting, I think, results and interesting results through some of the concepts that you developed. For paper one, after the Francis's paper just now, is that we have invited Dr. Gok Sin Ju to talk about her reaction to the paper. And the idea is that with her comments and so on, she's a policy person, we can provoke more questions and taking the results that we just heard to some other specific context within Singapore. Sun Ju is a senior member of staff within SkillsFuture Singapore, and SkillsFuture Singapore is the government skill agency which oversees the national training provisions, vocational qualifications, funding for training, including the individual learning account, known as SkillsFuture Credit, promoting lifelong learning, and it is also the owner of the Singapore Skill Framework. And so Sinju does pretty much everything, right? Superwoman, I think, most ideal to come and give her reaction. So may I introduce Sinju to join our discussion. The floor is yours, Sinju.
Thank you, Francis, and thank you, Johnny. And first, I'd like to thank Francis for the very interesting study and the very intelligent use of two of our study in Singapore, the SLS and skills utilization study and skill and learning survey. I think that's fantastic. And I must say that the finding is not surprising at all. But it comes as not too bad news from my perspective. I just want to very quickly respond, because in view of time, I think we should give more time to everybody to ask questions. But the first response I wanted to give is, number one is, I think the research team has done a fantastic job of enhancing the way we measure mismatch. Because traditionally, you look at all the mismatch literature, they tend to just take on the qualification mismatch, and that's it. They leave it there. But using task analysis is certainly give us an in-depth understanding of the job content, the nature of job, which is exactly what SkillsFuture Singapore, my team, is doing under the Skills Development Group. We look at job content, we analyze how job is changing, we'll look at work tasks, and then we'll look at skills. So I think this is definitely moving in the correct directions. I just want to quickly respond to a few points to say that what we have observed over the last 3 years as we look at job posting, data on job posting. Number one is that there is an increasing technology, tech content in almost all the job roles, whether you talk about the professional, manager, executive, or the more rank and file jobs. So both they are light tech job roles and they're also deep tech job roles. So I guess the question then I put forth for the research team to consider at the next round of study is, then how can we sharpen the use of task analysis, knowing the fact that the tech content will be increasing over time because technology deployment is getting easier and easier, and there's a lot of turnkey solution that you can just plug and play nowadays. The second observation from us is that the employers are demanding the workers to now the workers moving forward. They say that this is what a most value add worker will looks like, are those who can create, who can use insights from data and create values, new values, for example, new product lines, new revenue sources. And this is what the employers say as this is the most desired workforce. And therefore, my question then is, what does this imply does this imply that certain work activity are more valuable than others, therefore compensated better? So this for us to think through. And the third observation we have is employers are actually saying, putting a lot more emphasis on critical core skills, or somebody call it soft skills, that are not tech related. And so my question is, if we were to continue to use a task analysis, then how can the researchers leverage on skills analysis and work analysis as a complementary analysis to better advise policy and program? So that's my quick response. So I want to quickly jump over to talk about SkillsFuture movement and in a very short summary. Our commitment in Singapore is about good job for everyone. It's not about just having a good paid job for graduate, but good job for everyone. And that means we actually have a policy commitment to say that we will not have wage stagnation. To measure a household income, there's no wage stagnation. And there's a very high commitment. And so the good job matching is not the sole responsibility of the supply side, which means you just ask education institution to be more relevant, do more better courses, but it required the policy commitment and a coordinated planning and implementation within the whole skill ecosystem. I think that is a given, okay? And within the skill ecosystem, we constantly look into how to tighten the nexus within them. So for example, like from education institutions to that of a workplaces, how do we close that nexus? So I think over the last few years, you can see that throughout SkillsFuture movement, there are a lot of this policy area shift. And then in terms of looking at how do we plan and coordinate future economy development or industry transformations, we always include talent and skills strategy. It has to be part of the pillar of planning. It cannot be leave it to the market. So we don't leave things to chance. And it's also very important for us to avail lifelong learning to citizens. And this to us is non-negotiable. And we have to pay attention to very small details like inclusivity. Are people getting it? Can people who need it able to access the training? That include the low skill, low wage. It also includes people with disability. So I think this is very important for us to pay attention to, not just the graduates. And we watch over every single details from quality of the training education outcome and also lifelong learning outcome. And lastly, of course, I just want to mention, which is why we're interested in research, and my research office colleagues are here. is that we constantly look at how can we use evidence to inform policy and practice, so that we can continue to enhance our practices. So that's why later on, I think we can discuss what are the potential research collaboration moving forward. I shall stop here and then back to you, Johnny.
Okay, thank you, Sunju. And okay, I think I've seen quite a few questions in in the chat sections there. Some of them I think may need both Sunju as well as Francis to make a response. And and again, thank you. My colleagues is helping me to spot the questions in the chat the section of the chat. One is that the first question: will it be possible to provide an overview of the task measurement instrument used and so on? I think that's, if you get in touch with our researchers and we can provide you a range of tasks that we use in the survey. Some of these are also used by other surveys as well, but both the UK versions and the Singapore ones are very similar. There's only one thing that I would like to add to that, is that these are very conventional measures in terms of tasks. And I've been kind of mindful about in recent times that in a lot of jobs that there's been increasingly a greater emphasis on kind of analytic data use skill within their task, their job. So, and those are not really covered by our measurements. So have a look at, get in touch with our researcher with that one if you want to know. The second one is that could you share the definition of task in the research job tasks? So for those who are in Singapore, you can even see a much greater kind of measurements in terms of tasks that is within a kind of framework like functions, roles, and tasks within the skills framework and so on. And you see a lot of relationship. Well, they're actually hierarchically connected. The third one's interesting. Maybe both of either Francis or Sunju can have a go. What about popular 21st century skills? How are they defined and valued, assessed in Singapore's labour market and higher education, skill development and the skill development agenda? So it's a very specific concept, as in Singapore, 21st century skills. And although it's kind of seen as kind of generic thing, which is really it overlaps with the task that we measure in the surveys there. So Francis may have a go that this task measure that we have, do they touch on the kind of generic things like 21st century skills? You know, it involves attitudes, a mindset, or something as well. So what are your comments?
Francis, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. The first question was could they have a look at an overview of the kinds of skills used? I think the best thing to do is to refer to one of the papers listed at the end of the slides. So they will be available soon after this presentation. If you look at the discussion paper, that's the fullest version. You'll see the list of the skills if you look at one of the analyses about halfway through the paper. So if you want to work on that, but I mean, say the second point was, you know, what is the definition of the tasks? I mean, essentially, what we ask is you take an activity such as like reading long reports, okay, or writing long reports is another one, and you ask the respondents how important those are in their job, and then you give them a scale of not at all important or only very little important, right the way up to essential. So you like I have a 5-point scale, and you have this from about 40 different tasks, and that's how the model works. So you've got fairly detailed description of tasks, but they're all generic tasks that you might find in any job to some extent or another. What you can't ask about in these surveys are occupation-specific tasks, things which are only relevant to one particular industry or occupation. But that's common to all this task-based analysis, which is now commonly used for many labour market analyses in many different countries. So, and then, well, then the question was, popular 21st century skills, how are they valued? Well, you'd need to tell me what you mean by the popular 21st century skills. But I think there's something I might be worth saying now, which would also be in partly a response to Soon Ju's comments, which is Golo and I did a study, which is not actually yet published, except in a discussion paper form, of the valuation of different types of skills and how that's changed over time and in different countries. And what we found is that there is a distinct increase in the valuation of what you called soft skills, Soonju. I'm not a fan of that term, but relationship skills, okay, communication skills, and a tendency for those skills to become more value in the labour market over time. Yeah, it's so what we can conclude from that, I'm not completely sure yet, but I think as an observation, it's interesting. I don't know whether that's the case in Singapore in particular, and it's something which I think once you build up a stock of ongoing skills surveys, you'll be able to examine in some detail. I mean, the point you looked at, very, very interesting, your job posting analysis, looking at that. The advantage of that is you get probably very much larger numbers than you can do in a survey. A survey's only got like a few thousand at most. They're expensive research instruments, and you can't suddenly, let's do 100,000 of them or something like that, obviously, or even, you know, given the size of Singapore, you know, even 10,000 would be relatively expensive survey to do. But I think you can build something up over time and look at it that way, and it's fairly easy to do that analysis. I mean, it's not trivial, but we know how to do those kinds of analyses. And Golo is somewhere here in the audience, and who led actually on the study that I'm referring to about the valuation of social skills. So I think in terms of the 21st century skills, it's a phrase which I'm not familiar with, and I'd need defining for me. But if it's meaning a combination of the technical skills to cope with new technologies, with artificial intelligence, with robots and so on and so forth, then again, actually coming to answer your question, Soonju, how do we, I think what you said was, how do we try to cope with that in our research? It is quite difficult actually, because to do it consistently with earlier surveys where those activities didn't actually exist, to describe the use of computers in a way in, say, 2025 compared to, say, 2010, well, you might want to have categories in the 2025 survey which simply didn't exist in the 2010 survey. So you have to find a balance between asking consistent questions so that you can compare it.
Yeah. Francis, I do agree with you. The pluses or the advantages of using a survey as an instrument, but I think more relevant to today's the context of today, that we cannot ignore the fact that we need to use big data to supplement, and then we can triangulate and see whether the trend is true from multiple sources, which we're trying to use job posting, CV data of people, even cost consumption data, because we do have a lot of cost consumption data. And what does it trying to tell us about the kind of skills in demand, the kind of skills needed to support what kind of new tasks that's expected of the workforce. And we have we must be able to measure it at the whole economy level. Of course, sectorally, we still need to be able to identify that. but at the whole economy level will allow us to better predict, I call it predictions, to know that moving forward we need this. So I think that's what my team is doing currently, building up the job skill repository in Singapore, and then trying to use big data, and we are definitely using skills and learning survey, and then business performance and skill survey to triangulate what the survey has told us and then what the data shown us. I think that is quite important. I think go back to one of the questions about the 21st century skills, and which is what I talk about all this while about critical core skills. In fact, we launched a refreshed set of critical core skills for the future economy in August last year. If you Google critical core skills in Singapore, you should be able to bring you there. In fact, we interviewed 28 industries, more than 128 firms, and all the CEO and the CHRO was sharing with us what they put down and say that this is the most fundamentally important. It was a new 16 skill set in 3 baskets about keeping yourself relevant, about how to work with others, and then about, in fact, the higher level of cognitive thinking required. How do you process information? So although we call it critical thinking, but if you look at within the critical thinking, there's a lot of transdisciplinary thinking required. There is a lot of sense making required, and how to create values from there. How do you create new solutions and new values? I think these are things that employer truly values, because there will be a lot of people who can do data, and these are easy to pick up. Technical skills are very easy to pick up. In fact, technical skills are skills we use to command the machines or to make an application work for us as part of our partners and at work. But I think the critical core skill part is the one that employer emphasize a lot, that they really think that the workforce truly need to develop in this particular area. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for your answers. And next questions there. First of all, thank you, Kolo, for answering some of the questions already. So next one is, what links would you see? Maybe this is a question for both, I think, Francis and Zongyi. What links would you see between economic and non-economic benefits and the possible signaling effects of education, in brackets, as opposed to skills/knowledge aspects of education? So any comments in terms of that question, or is that clear? Is that question too short?
Not terribly clear to me. What are the links between the economic and the
non-economic and non-economic benefits and the possible signaling effects of education?
I mean, the signaling effects of education is when you're signaling often unobserved things. You're signaling that you have, whether it's some kind of innate ability or something which you got from your university or your polytechnic or whatever, which is unobserved, and you can't necessarily pin it down, but you want a graduate because you know they're better at it, or that, yeah. So, that suggests that if you're in a job that requires you to have a higher level qualification, that's where the economic benefit comes in. Yeah. So yes, I think that might be what the question's getting at there.
Yeah, I'm not too sure about the benefits one. Perhaps we move on. We've got a lot of questions there. The next one is that, does higher education ensure we get decent jobs, decent and secure for graduates?
Okay.
So I think it's a much wider question there. Any response?
Decent jobs is a very big question, and it refers to more than just the pay, undoubtedly. I mean, actually, the phrase decent job, I don't know whether that's meant in the same sense that the International Labour Office means it, but in Europe, it would mean, high quality jobs, which are not just in terms of pay and prospects, but also in terms of working time quality, in terms of work pressure, in terms of the physical conditions and social conditions and so on and so forth. And my short answer to that is that a university degree by no means guarantees you that at all. If you have a boss that bullies you, for example, then you have a very bad social environment, and your well-being at work can be very low. So when it comes to job quality, it's much broader than just the skills that you use. I mean, skills that you use is an integral, important part of job quality, and that's true everywhere. But it's also the case that job quality analysis, it's very, very interesting question, and a very interesting point for further analysis, because giving people a good life is ultimately what good policy is about, and it's more than just for skills. And so we need to find good jobs for people who have lower levels of education. Why not?
Yes. Zongyi, your response from the policy point of view?
No, I thought I mentioned that earlier in one of my points, is to have good job is almost a universal policy desire. And that doesn't mean that we only look at supply side to say that if you go to the degree, if you go to education, you will definitely get. I think the key thing is who is looking at what kind of job is created in the economy, and that requires us to have a policy overview as well, to know that and to monitor and say that is the economy really creating good jobs. I think in the early, I think I saw David Ashton here just now. David, in one of his early paper, he talked about how Singapore late 1980s decided to go for advanced manufacturing and really push out some of the low value add manufacturing out of the Singapore. And that's precisely how we are chasing after ensuring that we have good jobs in Singapore for all citizens, and not just about the graduates. I think that required a lot of careful thinkings and coordinations. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you. The next questions are very interesting. I think that perhaps Francis could give a general kind of response, and then Zongyi a specific one. Now, this question in terms of Singapore policies. Now, how could the results of the study implicate the way we look at training programs? So, one of you, please, you want to go ahead?
Look at training programs.
Yeah, looking at the task-warranted concept, underutilization because task, etc. What would you respond?
I would reply this way. Yeah, Johnny, I will reply this way, is that this particular methodology or approach, it is very promising, and we need to develop this further. And that's why I have a lot of research wish list to discuss with Francis after this, to say that whether they're keen to continue to work with us, to look into, for example, I can name 3 of my research questions that I want to ask Francis whether he's keen. Is when business models are changing, operating models are changing, and technological augmentations are taking place at unprecedented speed, how can we better anticipate the skills needs and the change in work activity to inform policy? This is my first question that I would love to embark on the research. The second one is creating sustainable volume of good job is a global policy desire. How can we determine task-warranted good jobs instead of task-warranted graduate jobs? I'm talking about task-warranted good jobs, because we need to understand what employer is willing to pay a premium for. I think that it will be a good job, or maybe not more than pay, of course, as Francis said, but I think it's the concept of task-warranted good job required further investigations. And then we can design better interventions that facilitate better match. And that's where the training program, the reskilling program, will be most useful at this point in time. So I think the research needed first before we can talk about designing program. The third question I have for Francis is about, can at a national level, at least in Singapore, this is what we do. So I'm putting the Singapore issues on the table. Is we are tracking skills progressions at a national level, and we're also tracking changing job mix in the labor market. How can we use both tasks and skills analysis to effectively monitor the change. Because I think this will help us a lot. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Francis, any?
I'm really trying to answer to Soon Ju's questions rather than the question you posed.
Sure.
Anticipating skills needs is quite difficult conceptually. I've been involved in projects with CEDIFOP in Europe about 10 years ago. And the aim was to interview large numbers of employers and ask them what kind of skills are they going to need in future. And the single most stunning finding from it is that how few employers could tell us. Most of them could say, well, something they would need over the next few months. But the thought of actually saying what they're kind of taking a 5-year perspective or a 10-year perspective was confined to very few indeed. Now, is that something that's characteristic of European employers? I don't know. So in the end, what we had to do with our mega project across Europe was to get people's assessment of how things had been changing over the last year and how things expected to kind of ongoing developments. But what was most remarkable was the lack of long-term thinking amongst employers. It kind of diminished my sort of expectation or faith in employers to be the informant of preference, if you like. And it means that the analysts who need to stand back and look at long-term developments are perhaps relatively more important. So I'm not very optimistic about that. I think, but you can still try and anticipate skill needs trends. I mean, one of the big questions is what's going to happen when more and more tasks become automated through artificial intelligence and through the use of robots. And there are a number of projects which go on to estimate the impact on employment, but as you probably know, they range quite a lot in terms of actually the implications. Some of them say there's going to be a complete and utter disaster. We're going to lose 50% of our jobs, and what are people going to do? Usual shock story. And others say, actually, and this is more like the OECD position, they could identify maybe about 10% of tasks which will be replaced by, or not so bad, in other words. And then what's most interesting for me is actually the quality of the jobs. How can we anticipate how the quality of jobs, the provision of decent work, will be affected by these new developments of artificial intelligence and so on? Now, the way to get that through task analysis, and I don't know, maybe Golo can even speak more about this, is you look at the specific tasks you asked about and see how common they are in occupations. And then you could say, well, certain kinds of tasks you would predict are more easily displaced by these new technologies. And you make that assumption. Say, for example, repetitive tasks and so on. And then you say, well, what would be the implication, given our data and how much repetitive tasks are being reported in all these different occupations and industries, what would be the implication for the next 5 years of those things kind of diminishing by 50%? And then you could look at that. So that would be the way to do it, but it's difficult, to be honest, to get employers to directly tell you what their future skill needs are. So, within an occupation, within a particular job, we know that tasks change over time.
Yeah.
But you can tell I'm a little bit of a futurology skeptic. we have to be we have to, when we do this, recognize that that we can't say a lot with certainty, with high confidence.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you, Francis. That's why I think we're trying to work with statisticians, data scientists, and economists to see whether we can come up with some kind of modeling tools using data and trends that we are seeing across the world to say that whether if certain things happen, will that lead to something else? And I thought what we can see is very clear is that the whole world is digitizing. So everything has to be on the internet, and the Internet of Things started off with manufacturing, has very, very quickly moved into other industry, be it power grid, be it even agriculture and aquaculture. Today we're looking at it. It's the Singapore startup. They born with high technology. They don't have the baggage to say that it was a traditional farming. They just leapfrog into IoT, the whole factory. So in fact, the agriculture and aquaculture sector will be high tech from the start, and that will demand a very different kind of workforce. The kind of engineer they need a lot of engineer, but the engineer will need to know how to do IoT, will need to know how to read data, and they need very few workers on the floor because everything is controlled on the dashboard. Maybe during harvesting they may need people, but thereafter it's not. And their business, the whole operating model has changed, and their business model is about exporting their expertise, not just about selling prawns and fish. So I think these are things that we are watching over and see whether we can have a better handle of what is to come, and then can we train ahead of time? Yeah,
I agree.
Okay, thank you. The next question, Francis mentioned about the role of employers. The next one may have something to do with it. The next question: can future research consider collecting data to either to verify or to debunk the perceptions regarding unfair hiring practices towards foreign labor, resulting in UG or MUG? So I presume this, in terms of hiring practices, is that it's got something to do with or influence the consequences of the concept of UG and MUG, underemployed, and the match definition. Francis, you would like to have a go at that one?
Yeah, the research we did has been focused on residents, the resident workforce. The surveys don't include the migrant workforce. So we can say less about the extent to which underemployment is prominent amongst the migrant workforce, I'm afraid. Yeah, I mean, I actually, I would just make one comment that in seeing to what extent the Singapore situation is distinct from other countries or just kind of following similar patterns, with these kinds of surveys, it would be helpful if they were larger and extended towards the jobs done by migrants. Obviously, migrants have had their education in their home countries rather than in Singapore for the most part. So it doesn't always apply. But when it comes to doing this kind of analysis and comparison, it has to be remembered that the migrant workforce is both skilled and unskilled. The migrant workforce is itself kind of polarized between different ends, but it's also a substantial part of the overall workforce in Singapore. So the international comparisons had to be understood in that context.
Yes, we do normally have difficulties of getting a sample from foreign workers. So that's the practicality side. There's something difficult, but yes, Francis's suggestion is a good one. The next one, though, is that maybe again for both either Francis in general and Sunju specifically for Singapore, is the pay gap of 200% between graduates and post-secondary people, I think, in Singapore, a concern for policymakers and researchers?
Is it a concern?
Does it worry you? Obviously.
it's relatively high by international comparison, I think. But but I say I think just to qualify in terms of the previous comments about the comparison of like with other countries. But it is ubiquitous that university educated people are paid more for the most part than people who don't have secondary education. And this particular premium we measure is just one way of looking at it. You can look at it in different ways. Whether it's something for concern, I think it's of particular concern if people don't have good access to university education who could benefit from it. But I don't know. I think I should leave. I should leave Soonju to answer that one.
I would say that if we look at the PIAC study, the round 1 PIAC study OECD conducted, it is a common phenomenon across most part of the world, developed economy, to have they call it return on investment. Education, return on education is where if you have more education, you tend to have higher wages. So it's not, Singapore's case is not uncommon, I would say, if you look across most, except for some country in Nordic country where the society or the decided to have wage compressions as a practice. Then I think that phenomenon is less prevalent. So I think it is a common phenomenon. I would say that in Singapore, we truly believe in equal opportunity, and therefore lifelong learning, it must be given to every citizen, allow them to take upon the opportunity to reskill themselves as often as they need, so that they can achieve their personal career aspiration. I think that part is very important. And we never say that you finish your formal education and that shall be it, and you leave it to the market. And that's the reason why SkillsFuture Singapore, we have implemented SkillsFuture credits, and the credit has been topped up last year in October to make sure that people have another chance. Everybody keep just reskilling yourself so that you know which career path you want to go for. And in the next 5 years of SkillsFuture movement plan, we even look at, we call it the next part of SkillsFuture, we even look at how to provide relevant signaling so that you have the insights, you can compare before you say, okay, this is the program I want to go into, this is the career I want to go into, because you can make that judgment call. And I call it informed decisions. And we are investing a lot of resources into this area. How do we help them make informed decisions? How can they get access to the latest labor market insights, to the latest skills in demand? What does employer looking for? And they also put forth the kind of a lot of the reskilling program, including career conversions, to help make careerists go into a pivot into the next job. So I think these are things that I would say that we will put our energy and resources in to just focus on the wage differential between graduate and others. Of course, I think we want a more equal society. That's given. That means we need to make sure that we have equal access, equal opportunity for all. Thanks.
Okay, very good. Let's move on because the time is coming up. Now, I'm doing the first come, first serve kind of approach there. Next one from Karen Evans. Very interesting question. I think must squeeze that one in. And what are the implications of Singapore's lifelong learning policies for the promotions of micro credentials that equates to graduate level tasks? And the aggregations of these micro credentials into graduate level qualifications. So it's interesting. So again, Francis, your thoughts, and Soonju, whether there's anything in the policy in Singapore that's going that direction.
I think Karen asked it. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just wondering whether Karen, who's there, would like to elaborate on that a bit, because she's right there.
Could you give control to Karen, please?
You need to unmute yourself, Karen.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I mean, the debate about micro credentials is quite a topical one, I know, in Singapore. And if you take the arguments about micro credentials, you could argue that it might lead to a scenario where the notion of being a graduate as a sort of status or an essence no longer matters. What matters is having some sort of collection of micro credentials that equate to the tasks that define graduate level occupations, and it becomes essentially a temporary state. I mean, that's taking micro credentials to its extreme. But I wondered if you had any thoughts about that. It's no longer about being a graduate; it's about having a collection of credentials that equate to the labour market at the time. Of course, when you approach it that way, that loses all of these wider benefits that Francis has already signalled are there in the notion of graduateness. But just from that point of view, you know, what does being a graduate mean?
Yes, Karen asked a very, very good question and really relevant one. In fact, if you look at the whole SkillsFuture movement, the intention is to get the whole society to value skills, from employer, individuals, education training institutions, to look at skills acquisitions and skills utilizations, than to say that I'm going to chase after a credential. Because we think that it is a skills that make things happen. It's like earlier on, I think there was a question about, is credential just a signaling tools, but nothing else? So since we started SkillsFuture movement, we have been looking at how to modularize modules of learning in modules that is easy, bite-sized to learn, and then you can go into the job and then continue to stack up to say that I can learn some more, I can learn additional, I can learn additional, I can learn additional. Whether or not it eventually will need to be stacked up to a further but larger qualification, I think that is something else. But at least minimally is you acquire the skills needed now so that you can enter a good job, so that you can keep on learning and enhancing. And this is very crucial because if you notice, as I mentioned earlier on, is the business model is changing so quickly and the operating model is changing so quickly. And Francis is right, employer cannot articulate what I need in terms of next 5 years of skills, but they know what they need now. And the now is the issue that the employer, the employees, and also the education training institute need to be able to react and respond very quickly. So long gone is the day that I'm just an engineer, I don't know anything about IT. Today is you're an engineer, you need to know about everything about IT. You need to know everything about data, you need to know everything about sales. So the hybridization of jobs really require us to keep having this refresh of skills, and the once off the front end loading of qualifications. Well, like what Francis said, is it gives you the ability to keep on learning. It gives the ability to keep on learning because you can learn better. You have a better learning skills. You have better, perhaps you can have better information processing skills. But then the momentum of learning, you have to keep carrying on. So yes, indeed, Karen, you're right about we continue to emphasize on micro credentialing, but whether or not the micro need to stack up to a full qualification to fulfill the signaling effect, I think that we can leave it to the market to decide. Thanks.
Great.
Francis, any comments or?
I think that's fantastic.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have anything further to add on that one, no.
All
Thanks
right,
very much.
we've got a few more questions, but
All
then
these
I think with the time is up, it's kind of just past 10 o'clock UK time and 5 o'clock Singapore time.
I think some of
Yes.
the questions can be answered, but we obviously haven't got any more time and we can't answer all the questions, but some of the additional materials, people who want to look into greater depth are perhaps going to be helpful there. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you, I think, for the Francis for the presentation, and also the behind the scenes support that, and Sunju, your input, very valuable, locating many of the issues also in the the Singapore context, very, very good policy context. And also I would like to thank Kieran and Hao for supporting me in the backgrounds there. So now it's time for the, I have to apologize, is that we can't cover the rest of the questions there, but we'll see if we can try to answer some of these if useful, we understand them properly, is that in the things that we can post online later on. So now it's time for the tea break. I wonder if we can take the next 15 minutes as a break, a well-earned break. And that please return around about, well, at 10:15 UK time and 5:15 Singapore time. Okay, thank you very much. All right, thank you. Thanks. We'll have a chat after.
Dr. Kaye, Dr. How, are you all ready?
Hi, yes,
Hi.
I'm going to try and share my
Maybe you could just try sharing your screen first while we wait for people to come back from the break.
Yeah. Can everyone see that?
Yes, maybe
Yes,
you'd like to go into, yep, that's right. Okay. Shall we give everyone like a minute or so to get back? Right. Shall we begin?
Okay.
Okay, yeah. A very good morning and good afternoon, depending on where we are. Right here in Singapore, it's about 5:16, 5:17, and over in the UK, about 10:17 or so. Welcome to the second presentation in today's event on changes in skill levels and inequality during the upper secondary phase. And to present it, I'm very glad to have Dr. Kaye and Dr. Phan from UCL to discuss this topic with us. Dr. Neil and Dr. How, please.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Yes, so this part of the seminar will be presenting the findings of the cross-national comparative analysis that we've done. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank our co-authors. Obviously, it's a shame Andy's unwell and unfortunately unable to be here. But also want to acknowledge the work that Nick did before he went to Southampton, and obviously to thank Hal, who'll be speaking a little bit later. So the presentation is in two main parts. I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes and presenting the findings of the statistical analysis. And then following this in part two, Hal is going to speak about how the findings, what the implications are on specific to the Singapore case. Okay, so the aim of this part of the project was to undertake a cross-national comparative analysis to really look at the effects of upper secondary system types and also individual system characteristics on skills acquisition during the upper secondary phase of education and training. And whilst there's been quite a lot written in terms of the system effects at primary level and at lower secondary level, there has been relatively little research done at the upper secondary level of education. And so what we've really tried to do here is build on earlier work that we've done, or the team has done, and provide kind of more robust evidence looking specifically at system effects at upper secondary level. And as you'll see when I come on to it, we're doing this by including a greater number of countries and territories, examining a wider range of system characteristic indicators, and also employing a variety of statistical methods. Before I get into the actual analysis, we looked at what had been said, perhaps in relation to lower secondary or primary education, and we find kind of 5 main hypotheses coming out of the literature. And just to run through these kind of very briefly, things like early tracking and privately funded schooling has been found not to consistently have a positive impact on skills levels, and is also kind of associated with much greater inequality in skills, opportunities, and outcomes. Similarly, school choice and diversity and competition between schools within a system are also not systematically associated across countries and system outcomes. There's also an extensive literature talking about curriculum standardization, that is using kind of core curriculum skills, skill sets, mandatory learning of maths or national language. And this has been shown in the literature to have a tendency to raise levels and to make the scores kind of less unequally distributed. Similarly, higher levels of participation in vocational learning, and this is kind of associated with a higher esteem attached to vocational learning, is also kind of associated with better overall outcomes, and again reducing the gaps, the skills gaps seen within countries and systems. And the fifth theme that comes out from the literature is very much about kind of teachers' skills and pay and ability and professional development, which are all positively associated with outcomes across different phases of education. So, with this in mind, we wanted to see whether or not there's evidence for this in similar systems, similar system effects across the upper secondary level. So really the first stage in our analysis was to kind of defining countries' systems types, so developing a typology. And this was very much based on those that are already well-founded within the literature on both comparative political economy and also on comparative education. However, what we have done is modified this based on the latest data, using relevant indicators. And what we found are 6 broad types of systems. And this is during the period when the young people in our sample were going through upper secondary education. So roughly between the years of 2008 and 2014. So I'm going to very briefly go through these 6 types, just so everyone has a kind of a contextual understanding of our typology. So type 1 systems are the most common within our sample of countries and territories. And these are school-based systems which are differentiated in terms of general academic and vocational provision. And each of these occurs in dedicated institutions. And whilst apprenticeships do exist within these systems, they tend to be quite separate and a residual system almost for a very small number of students. Programs in these systems tend to last for 2 or more, usually 3 years. And the qualification that you receive at the end of the system gives access to higher education in terms of general academic students, or to vocational tertiary education for vocational students. But what's new is we've identified as well this kind of subset of type 1 systems. And these are, again, differentiated systems, but that have high levels of participation in vocational provision, often a substantial element of apprenticeships, work-based training, although still schools-based, having this opportunity to have an apprenticeship as well. And this is the type that contains Singapore, but also other countries, Netherlands, Denmark, and Finland. The type 2 systems are also schools-based, but they are what's called comprehensive systems. So you have general and vocational provision within the same institutions. And again, the apprenticeship system exists, but it's again very separate and quite small. And within these type 2 systems, we've identified 2 separate models, one which is more applicable to the North American countries, and one which is more applicable to the Nordic countries. And the type 2 systems, generally speaking, have a higher degree of standardization of curricula and assessment than the type 1 differentiated systems. And then the difference between the Nordic and the North American models is we see a lot more kind of standardization in terms of governance and regulation within the Nordic model, and much more diversity of provision in the North American model. And then we come on to the type 3 systems, which are the systems most commonly associated with Germany and Austria, where you have participation almost equally split between those who are in school-based general education and those who are in an apprenticeship employment-based system. So they have very different tracks, are very distinct in terms of curricula and governance, etc. And the apprenticeship system, moreover, is really closely tied to labour market institutions. And as a result of this, there's a much higher or much greater parity of esteem between students who go into the academic track and those who go into the vocational track. And finally, we have the type 4 systems, which are mixed systems and have a real kind of diversity of different programs, different qualifications, variable length, variable quality. But overall, the dominant track is the academic track. And this, again, in turn leads to a much more pronounced gap in esteem between the high status academic track and the diverse number of less esteemed vocational tracks. And this leads in turn to lower rates of vocational participation within these systems. And generally speaking, there's a lack of standardization. And this has also been associated with high rates of early school leaving. And these are the kind of systems that pervade in the UK and Australia, kind of Anglo systems, and also in places like Spain and Israel. So I think that was an important first step for our analysis to kind of assign countries to systems type. And now I just want to spend a bit of time talking through our methodology before presenting some of the findings. So we were aiming to investigate both the role of systems types and individual system characteristics on skills outcomes and inequalities during the upper secondary phase. And the way we approached this was through a pseudo cohort analysis using data from 2 sources, the OECD PISA program, the assessment in reading and maths at age 15, and Survey of Adult Schools, or PIEC, assessment of literacy and numeracy in adults. And we were able to use a subsample of adults at the end of upper secondary education, so in the age group 18 to 20. So I just want to highlight here that is a pseudo cohort analysis. So these are nationally representative samples of young people aged 15 and also 18 to 20. Although of course these aren't the same individuals who are being assessed in PISA as they are in PIEC. So they're not cohorts in the strict sense of the term, but pseudo cohorts in this case. And the data that we take as illustrated at the bottom of this slide are from 2 rounds of PIEC in 2011-12 and 2014-15. And these have been matched with the PISA data from when the majority of the people in this cohorts will have been age 15. And overall, this gives us a data set for 32 countries and territories with a kind of good matching up of the beginning and the end of upper secondary education. So I'll speak a bit later on about the data on indicators of system characteristics. We, as well as using our typology of systems types, as I've mentioned before, we also modeled individual indicators of system characteristics. And these were primarily taken from the UNESCO Institute for Statistics database. And I'll speak a bit more about individual indicators in a little while. In terms of our analytical approach, we used a kind of 3 stages, if you like, and this will be the order that I present our findings in. So first of all, we looked at just summary statistics to give a kind of broad overview of the relative position of countries and systems in relation to key outcome measures. Secondly, we then undertook a regression modeling approach, firstly using ordinary least squares regression to really look at the extent to which systems types and later on individual characteristics were associated with the outcomes and score distributions or inequalities in literacy and numeracy. And then finally, we undertook a difference in difference approach to provide really something which was more robust, controlling for kind of these omitted time constant factors which were likely to affect outcome scores. So this is a very similar approach, but we're adding a level of robustness here to really kind of check our homework, if you like. So I'm going to move on to our findings now. And firstly, the kind of summary statistics looking broadly at the outcome measures that we are using. So this slide shows you literacy within the PIAC data, so the age group of 18 to 20, and these are national averages. And as we can see at the top of the scale, we can see the kind of the East Asian systems. So you're looking at Japan, Korea, Singapore, along with the Netherlands and Finland, which, as I've mentioned before, are type 1B systems, very similar to the Singapore system. At the other end of the scale, we have Chile and Israel, and also Southern European countries, Spain, Italy, and Greece. And we see a similar pattern as well in numeracy outcomes, as we can see on this slide. At the top of the sample are the Japanese, Korean, and Singaporean systems again, with Finland and the Netherlands, and this time Lithuania as well. Whereas at the bottom, we can see Chile, Israel, and the Southern European countries again, as well as this time we have the United States. More interestingly, here we plot the outcomes of literacy on the left-hand side of the screen and numeracy on the right-hand side of the screen along their respective y-axes, with the corresponding average scores in reading and maths as applicable on the x-axis. So this illustrates, and I'll just want to dwell a bit of time to give you a chance to look at these plots, but it really illustrates which countries remain high in terms of outcomes throughout the upper secondary stage. So here we've highlighted Korea, Finland, and Singapore. We can also see those who remain relatively low throughout upper secondary, here Chile and Israel and the Southern European countries. But we can also see those that start low but improve, relatively speaking, throughout upper secondary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Lithuania, and those who do the opposite. And primarily this is about Ireland and French-speaking Canada in literacy, but not in numeracy. So obviously these summary statistics are looking primarily at scores, at national average scores, and this will obviously hide the distribution of skills outcomes within each country. So what we've also chosen to look at is inequalities, score distributions, which are measured using Gini coefficients, where 0 is equal to perfectly equal scores and 1 is perfectly unequal. So what this chart is showing is we can look at the grey boxes in the grey bars at the bottom, if you like, to kind of demonstrate how inequalities have changed between the scores in PISA and the scores after upper secondary in the PIAC data. So you can see further towards the left, the longer bars are equal to greater reductions in inequalities for literacy, this is, meaning that these countries have done the most to kind of reduce inequalities and outcomes are then more equally distributed at the end of upper secondary than at the beginning. And on the far right, you can see that even that in the Chilean system here, the outcomes are actually becoming more unequal compared to the distribution of scores in PISA. And the same chart for numeracy, we can see that there are more modest improvements, more modest reductions in inequalities throughout upper secondary education. And there are a greater number of systems where inequalities are actually increasing following the upper secondary phase. So just before I move on to the outcome, the findings of the models, I wanted to say a little bit about the individual systems characteristics that we included in our models. So we used several, about, I think it was 12 or 13 different indicators which we included in our models. I just want to highlight 2 or 3 that we used, which turned out to be quite significant. So standardized curriculum, what does it mean? Basically, we're asking whether or not students are required to take a course in national language or maths. And this becomes a score between 0 and 4. 0 meaning no programs are required for students to take either subject, all the way up to 4. So at 4, all students are required to take both subjects, regardless of which track they're in. And this indicator was based on previous work done by Jeremy Hodgson and his colleagues in 2010, and updated where applicable using the Eurydice and UNESCO databases. Similarly, the UNESCO databases were the primary source of most of the other indicators. For example, vocational prevalence. So how prevalent is it that young people undertake vocational education? Teacher workload, which is a composite of 2 different indicators, average students per teacher and average number of teaching hours per year. And this is just a list of the other characteristics that we did model for, and are presented in the larger discussion paper, which will be highlighted at the end, but which I'm not presenting the results here, and which in most cases were not statistically significant. So these included duration of the upper secondary stage, when first selection occurs, the typical age at which young people complete the upper secondary, teachers' salaries, teachers' starting salaries, that is, and average educational expenditure within a country, number of school types, and the upper secondary graduation rate. So the models that I'm going to go on to present now, firstly, we're going to present models looking at systems effects, particularly using our systems typology as our variable of interest, followed by models which are looking more specifically at individual systems characteristics. Excuse me. So these statistical models control in different ways for prior attainment in our pseudo cohorts. On the left, the OLS regression includes PISA scores in reading and maths, where applicable, as a control variable. And the difference in difference analysis on the right actually models the change in scores between the time of PISA and the PIAC examinations. So the latter approach also has the benefit of controlling our other time constant variation. So looking at the effect of systems types, we compare the average outcomes for each system type with the reference type 1 differentiated systems. These are the most common type in our sample and form our reference group. So here what we can see is average scores for literacy are significantly lower in the type 2A systems. These are the comprehensive North American model systems, and significantly lower in type 4 mixed systems. We also see lower average scores in the comprehensive Nordic model systems and in the dual systems, although these aren't found to be statistically significant. A similar relationship can be seen in the numeracy scores. Comprehensive systems, the North American model type, and the mixed systems have significantly lower average scores compared with differentiated systems. The more robust difference in difference analysis on the right, they show a similar pattern, although this time it's only the type 2A systems, the North American systems, that are shown to be statistically significantly worse than the type 1 reference group. Again, moving on to look at the same models, but using inequalities, so the Gini coefficient inequalities as outcomes. And here, interestingly, we see a very similar pattern to the outcomes themselves. Both the type 2A systems and the type 4 systems are significantly more unequal at the end of upper secondary compared to the type 1 systems, after controlling for inequalities seen in the PISA scores. And in the more robust difference in difference analysis, in addition to these two systems, we also see significant increases in inequalities for literacy scores in the type 1B systems. This is in literacy, but not in numeracy, interestingly. So as I've mentioned, we ran several models on individual characteristics of upper secondary education systems, really as a way of seeing if we could isolate what was driving the differences in outcomes and inequalities seen between the systems types. Not all of the indicators that we modeled returned statistically significant results. Nonetheless, 3 that did appear to work, have a clear correlation with outcomes, were teaching workload, which was negatively associated with outcomes in literacy and numeracy. A standardization score of the curriculum, which again was positively associated with outcomes in numeracy. And vocational prevalence, which was positively associated with both literacy and numeracy outcomes, even using the more robust difference in difference methodology. And the relationship between these 3 indicators and the distributions in scores, so the inequality scores, were also evident. And from this table, we can see that the teaching workload positively associated with unequal outcomes. That is, countries with greater teaching workload are associated with higher levels of inequalities in scores for both literacy and numeracy throughout upper secondary. And systems with greater curriculum standardization and higher levels of vocational participation saw significant reductions in inequalities, lower levels of inequalities of outcome at the end of upper secondary compared to the start. So I know there's been a lot of charts and tables so far, and I just want to leave you with a kind of overall conclusions. You know, what do we learn from this analysis? What are the kind of take-home messages? Really, there are 3 key takeaways from this extensive comparative cross-national analysis. Firstly, you know, on a systems type level, you know, the North American model and the mixed systems appear to perform, you know, consistently poorly in relation to other systems types, both in both domains for literacy and numeracy skills acquisition during the upper secondary stage of education. Secondly, they also appear to do less to mitigate the skills inequalities during this phase of education compared to other types. And looking underneath that, what's driving this apparent inequality is we've identified 3 key system characteristics. You know, that is having a greater curriculum standardization, you know, enforcing mandatory learning of national language and mathematics. We've also highlighted where higher rates of vocational prevalence are associated with raising skills levels and reducing inequalities, and also having, you know, lower levels of teacher workload. So these may seem kind of, in some instances, these may seem self-evident, but now we have kind of robust evidence to back these findings up. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to my colleague Hao, and she's going to talk through some of the implications of these findings for the Singaporean case in particular. don't know how we're going to do this with the screen sharing. How do you have control of my screen?
Can you leave it on? Is it okay to put it on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want me to forward the slides for you?
Yes. If you can just control it from your side. Is it okay?
Yeah. No problem. Give me a.
All right. Can you start with my with the slide on implications for Singapore, please? Yeah. All right. Thank you for the presentations, and I'm just gonna like add on new presentations and try to talk about the specific like implication for Singapore. I will first highlight the levels and distributions of literacies and numeracy scores before and after the upper secondary phase in Singapore. I will then explain the factor that influence skills outcome in Singapore based on our cross-country analysis. And finally, I will propose some of the potential pathway that Singapore could take to increase core skills levels and reduce inequality in skills distributions among upper secondary students. I should emphasize that since Singapore has already performed quite well in average score, that these recommendations might be more relevant to reducing skills inequalities. Next slide, please. So just to have just to give you an idea of Singapore data on core skill levels and skills inequalities. So from new presentation, we learned that Singapore is categorized as a type 1B system, together with Denmark, Netherlands, and Finland. And the main characteristic of this system is that they have differentiates and dedicates upper secondary institutions, high rates of participations in vocational programs, and with a substantial elements of work-based trainings. In Singapore, in terms of like change in skills between age 15 and age 18 to 20, according to our research, Singapore maintained its high positions relative to other countries in both literacies and numeracy skills, but did not significantly improve on it during the upper secondary phase. Regarding inequality in literacy and numeracy, Singapore was less successful in reducing inequality in literacy, but in numeracy is among the most successful country in inequality mitigation, with only 5 countries, 5 out of 32 countries doing better. Next, please. So how far do these the indicators that we found out explain Singapore outcome? We divide them into 3 different categories. The first one is standardizations. The second one is parity of esteem, and the last one is about others qualitative indicators. So for the first one, standardizations, we look at the theoretical durations of upper secondary school, age of completion, and cohort years. With these indicators, Singapore score relatively high, with upper secondary school, upper secondary education normally lasts between 2 to 3 years and ending at 18 or 19 years, with 90% of the age cohorts attending upper secondary qualifications. So these 3 indicators explain contributes to raising skill levels and reducing skills inequality in Singapore. In terms of curriculum standardizations, Singapore's score are relatively low on this indicator. According to our research, is score only 1 out of 4. This reflects the fact that classes in maths and English are not mandated on all programs in JCs, polytechnics, and ITEs. However, so normally the low score in curriculum standardizations will be will not work well for skill skill equality. However, Singapore managed to avoid high level of skills inequalities in numeracy. This is due to the high level of attainment sorry, I think there's a mistake here. So it's due to the high level of attainment in maths achieved in Singapore lower secondary education system, and also it's due to the availability of both compulsory and optional maths related course in both ITE and polytechnics. I also note that there are other factors that contributing to high standards of Singaporean students for in terms of standardizations. For example, policy making in Singapore is centralized, and there's a high level of so it's a high degree of alignment between policy implementations and classroom practice. Moreover, Singapore high standards in education are also secured through a centralized process of developing, assessing, and endorsing textbook and materials in teaching material by the Ministry of Education. Next, please. I now move to the second factors that explain Singapore outcome. That's focused on vocational prevalence and the spending, the ratio of spending for students in vocational programs and general academic programs. So for vocational prevalence, Singapore scores a relative high for the proportion because it has the proportions of students on vocational programs because of the high proportions of students on vocational programs. It's more than 70%, but the number of students participating in school-based or hybrid apprenticeship is rather small. It's according to our research, it's less than 10% of students in ITE, and this might be limiting the beneficial effects of the high rates of vocational learning on inequality reductions. In terms of the ratios of spending for students in vocational programs and between vocational programs and general academic programs, in Singapore, government spending per student in ITE average like 2/3 of that in higher educations, and it's pretty high, like compared to other places like in the UK, for instance. It is more like 1 to 3, and the investments in ITE and polytechnic infrastructures to create a campus-like experience for students also shows a strong commitment to transforming the status of vocational tracks and raising parity of esteem for vocational students, and it's helped to and mitigate the negative impact of inequalities in their skills. Next, please. I now come to the third section on with the focus on other qualitative indicators that explain Singapore outcomes. I'm listing here teachers' qualities and pedagogy and cultures, and these are not quantified. But so we have to rely on other literatures. Firstly, for teachers' qualities, actually in our analysis, as News already presented, we found out that the teacher workload has certain impact on skill outcomes, but we don't have that. That statistic for Singapore, so we relies on teacher qualities, and on the literatures, it shows that teachers teachers' quality in Singapore, from recruitment, from cognitive ability of student teachers, there's qualifications, there's provisions of professional training and developments. All of these indicators have been key to successful students' outcome during upper secondary education and training in Singapore. We also noticed that pedagogies and cultures have both like negative, positive and negative impact on skills inequalities in Singapore. For example, the mastery learning can be quite efficient in raising the basic skills of lower achievers, therefore reducing the inequality in numeracy skills. Also, we can see that Singapore's with its Asian cultures will encourage performance-driven mentalities and the pursuit of excellence, or as Wong et al. Call is a culture of collectivisms. However, the combinations of cultural factors which favor academic studies and the natures of labor markets in Singapore also have like negative effect in vocational education and apprenticeship like provision in Singapore. I would like to explain more on this because we know that Singapore had a high rate of vocational learning. This is because there's a very high proportions of cohort attending polytechnic courses. However, the recruitment to ITE remain much lower. Internship and work experience placements are becoming more prevalent in polytechnics and in sorry, I don't know how to say it, NITEC 3 courses in ITEs, but apprenticeships are only a marginal part of initial vocational education and trainings, because they are being reserved mainly for graduates of polytechnics and ITE. This might present a lost opportunity for in Singapore to judge from developments in other countries. Next, please. So based on our analysis of the impact of different factors on Singapore outcome, we proposed two policy recommendations for Singapore. The first one is to add compulsory English or language courses. I emphasize that these courses should be taught and assessed as separate subjects by teachers specifying in the subject. And this is more relevant for ITE and polytechnics, not in JC, because of the high qualities of programs in JC. And these our recommendations based on the data which show that the inequalities of literacy are reduced less in Singapore, and it's remained quite high at the end of 18 to 20. Like why numeracies, inequality of numeracies are not like that. So adding compulsory English or language courses will help to enhance ITE students' perspective of progression into polytechnics and universities, which is currently capped at 25% and can go higher. And we also think that a compulsory English and language course would help to develop ITE students' academic writings and help to support popularities and prestigious purchase of ITE provisional, or help to raise parity of STEAM between vocational students and academic students. These related to our second recommendations about increasing high quality apprenticeship take-up in Singapore, which is currently reserved for graduates of polytechnics and IT. This is based on experience from countries with dual system apprenticeship training. In this country, having these high quality apprenticeship take-up will give access to well-paid skills and professional jobs, and also help to raise skill level for lower achievers and reduce skills inequalities. So I'm aware that because our presentation is quite short, so some of the issue might not be clear for you, but we have a discussion paper that you can refer to at later stage. Neil, can you show the last slide? Yeah, so that's the research paper that is available online. If you are interested in the paper, you can check it. Thanks.
Thanks, Hao.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Neil, and thank you, Hao. To respond to the paper, we have firstly Dr. N. Varaprasad, who is partner and principal consultant at Singapore Education Global Consultancy. Dr. Varaprasad is quite a powerhouse in the education field. He used to be principal and CEO at Temasek Polytechnic, as well as being deputy president at the National University of Singapore. Dr. Varaprasad, please, would you respond to the presentation that we've just heard, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just unmute myself. Professor Sung, Professor Green, Dr. Renée Tan, Neil, and Hao, thank you very much for your presentation. Can you all hear me, please?
Yes.
Okay. Well, very good morning, afternoon, and good evening to everyone present. I want to say, first of all, I'm very honored to be here with all of you. Thank you for inviting me to be a discussant on this particular study. But before I begin my comments, I would like to just take a minute, if you will, to explain my own background, as it might have a bearing on what I have to say. Let me just start by saying that I'm an engineer by training. I've taught engineering for many years at the University of Singapore and later the National University of Singapore. I have 16 years of experience of managing polytechnics in Singapore, from the oldest one to the newest at that time, Temasek Polytechnic, including establishing one from the ground up, from scratch. So I'm happy to see that previous discussant Sun Ju, who is now the Chief Skills Officer at SkillsFuture, here, as she was one of my teaching faculty at that time. But the reason I want to point out about my background is that I have no background in educational research or policy making. So in fact, the language which I might use will be quite different from what you've been hearing all morning or all afternoon so far. So my jobs including that of Chief Executive of the National Library Board, have always been to get things done for the greatest impact on students, for colleagues, for business and industry, and for society at large. So I have not been involved in policy making, but I have been at the implementation end of policy. And as I have said in my interaction with many policymakers that I have known, is that execution, good execution, is what makes policy come alive for the intended beneficiaries. So I'm at the execution end of the policies that are developed by SkillsFuture, by the government, by the Ministry of Education, and so on. So while I'm interested very much in how you people go about it, I am not at the research or policy making end, although from time to time I have attended meetings at the ministry to find out what the latest developments are and to give my feedback. So with that in mind, I have to say this, because I take a practical view of what's useful and how feasible it is from an execution or user standpoint. So let me just say and give my preemptive apologies to all the researchers, because it is to their credit, I have to say, that they didn't choose a fellow academic to be a discussant. So they can take my comments more as requests for clarifications rather than as any form of negative criticism, and also pardon my non-research based or non-academic language. So here goes. As you have heard from Neil and from Hao, this research study may be conveniently divided into three parts. First of all, the rationale for the study, the hypothesis that they want to test, and why they see these as important. Secondly, the study itself, how it was conducted, what data they used, and so on. And lastly, the conclusions and the policy recommendations, especially for Singapore. And because I'm more familiar with the Singapore context, I think most of my remarks would be focused on the Singapore context. So I hope that is okay with everyone. The study itself aims to find out if different types of systems of education, post-secondary education, have an impact on learning and on retention of skills. And when we talk about skills, they particularly mean numeracy and literacy, because these are the data points that are available, as well as the spread of these skills, and which are referred to in the study as inequalities. And also to look for other reasons, such as curriculum standardization, the prevalence of vocational education, teacher training, teacher pay, staff development, and so on, and to see how these are correlated with their findings. And from these, to try and draw some conclusions from the standardized data from a number of countries, which you have seen, about 25 countries. And they have used the changes in order or the changes in ranking of these countries on the various tests and on the differences in the ratings to conclude whether any one country or system is doing better or not with respect to inequalities and changes in inequalities. The study, of course, uses the rankings of PISA scores at age 15 and SAS scores at age 18 to 20 to make comparisons. So we have two time data points for two parameters, numeracy and literacy, for each of the countries or educational system. So my comments or clarifications, you might say, would cover the following themes. First of all, the use of the Gini coefficient for skills inequalities, and skills inequality as a concept in itself. I have some questions regarding those. Secondly, the conflating of literacy and numeracy with skills as we normally would understand it. Although, of course, literacy and numeracy are skills, but standard numeracy and literacy education in Singapore stops at grade 10. And that's for a large number of students, about 65 to 70% of students. After that, it becomes more workplace-oriented communication skills and workplace-oriented mathematics. The third point I wanted to raise is that of the impact of the Singapore's bilingualism policy on skills, especially literacy. Whether there are any conclusions regarding these with respect to other countries which also have bilingualism. You did mention national language, but I take that in national language in Singapore, it is the English language, although we do have another national language. But it is compulsory to learn your mother tongue as well. And there are many people, many groups of people for whom the mother tongue may not be those on offer. For example, Peranakans for Eurasians and non-Tamil speaking Indians, for example. And finally, I would ask the question about what is the relevance of all these to the future workplace? Because skills deepening, as was in the previous discussion raised by Sunju and the SkillsFuture people, are not so much in literacy and numeracy, but in actual workplace skills, workplace knowledge and skills. So let me come to my first point, which is on the Gini coefficient. As you all know, the Gini coefficient is normally used to indicate income inequalities. As neoliberal economic policies in many countries have pushed the Gini coefficient higher and higher. However, we should note that the Gini coefficient is based on the distribution of a fixed national income, 100% of the national income to 100% of the population based on a Lorenz curve. So all of the income has to be distributed to all of the people. So in that sense, it is a zero-sum situation where you take all the national income and you measure how this is distributed across all the people. I would have liked some information about how the inequality Gini, skills inequality Gini coefficient is calculated, because it is not a zero-sum game. Unlike income, skills is not a zero-sum game. Higher skills does not come at the cost of lower skill for others, unless, of course, educational opportunities are subject to new liberal policies as well. So the use of Gini coefficient in the way that is calculated, which I'm not aware how it was calculated, may not be appropriate. If you had used, for example, standard deviation to measure the inequalities, that may have been better, because it doesn't mean that someone with higher skills, they got the higher skills at the expense of other people. Furthermore, if the mean skill level is already high, but the standard deviation is high, is this worse than when the mean is not high, the mean is low, but the standard deviation is also lower, which means less inequality? So if Singapore has been high performing in PISA and TIMSS and PEARLS and SAS, even in the lower quartiles, for example, the lower quartiles of the Singapore student cohort performs higher than many other countries. For example, the last 25% performs higher than the high performing students in other countries. In fact, it has been pointed out that the level of mathematics and literacy in Singapore is 1 to 2 grades higher than in other countries. So if that is the case, then is the so-called skills inequality an issue at all? Given that 97% of grade 10 students proceed to some form of post-secondary. You know, from the abstract and from the introduction, it would appear that skills inequality and skills were meant to be actual vocational skills, but it turns out to be conflated with numeracy and literacy. So I think some greater clarity in the use of the word skills would have been useful. The understanding of skills at grade 10 and at post-secondary grade 12 and at ITE and poly are different. What we mean and understand by the word skills is different in secondary school, in JC, at the poly and ITE. They're different. It's not the same understanding. But if we are using numeracy and literacy, then I think they're not broadly comparable. So, for example, this leads to some unexpected conclusions, especially if you see the policy implications that was pointed out for Singapore to increase the number of high quality apprenticeships. But this is nothing to do with numeracy or literacy. It has to do with the type of education system, whether 1B is the most appropriate for ITE students, whether they have access to polytechnics, whether polytechnic students have access to universities. How can this route be opened up? But this has nothing to do with skills inequality. It's nothing to do with numeracy or literacy. It has to do with a different kind of educational track. And there's more to be said about that. There is also an expectation by the researchers that skills inequality should decrease as students move into post-secondary. But the authors find that, relatively speaking, Singapore drops in the ranking for 18-year-olds as compared to 15-year-olds. But this is to be expected, in my view, because 70% of each cohort goes into the technical and vocational pathways, where literacy and numeracy are not taught in the same way as they are taught in the junior colleges, as they are for the non-TVET stream. However, if we talk about real workplace skills, then one can expect some of these inequalities, the so-called skills inequalities, to decrease. So this is something that I think there's a little bit of commingling or conflation of the definition of skills. So in the context that I come from, where I expect to see skills being defined more broadly, this was a little bit of a letdown for me. There's also an assumption that skills inequality at the school level is a predictor of later income inequality. So if you look at page 2 or 3 of the report, it says that why skills inequality is important at the school and post-secondary level is that it is a predictor of later income inequality. But this is a causal loop. This is a interactive causal loop, because low-income households, as was pointed out in the previous presentation, where parents with non-university backgrounds, low-income households are also known to have less home support for teaching and learning and doing well at school. So we need to explore this loop to determine the actual direction of causality, rather to make a conclusion or a statement that skills inequality would be a predictor of income inequality. It might well be the other way around, might be the stronger causality rather than the way that it has been defined. We also have, of course, the inequality of firms, the inequality of technologies. For example, we have firms that range from the highest level of the most sophisticated multinational global companies to mom and pop retail shops, motor mechanic companies, to hairdressing salons. The inequality of firms and the use of technologies will be far greater than the skills inequalities in numeracy and literacy. So I think there's a lot more to be said about skills inequalities. My final point is that by using data from 2013 and 2017 respectively, how does the study address the needs of the future? The post-COVID world is universally acknowledged that it is going to be very different. that workplace realities would be fuzzy for a while, that we have not settled in to any form of normal life. And we know that the new normal is going to be quite dynamic and volatile, and it's not likely to settle down. So this is not a fault of the study. Disrupted workplaces, job functions have greatly increased uncertainties about people, from people. So some policies will succeed, some may not work. That doesn't mean that we should end up with policy paralysis. And in Singapore, particularly, where the Skills Future initiative and the skills deepening initiatives are very closely tied to the future digitalization and the future technologies that companies like to see or would like to see. It's very closely tied. So, you know, we are kind of a joined up government. So I'm not too concerned that we might end up in a very difficult situation. I take the point about increased workplace apprenticeships and workplace internships, and I'm happy to say that this is already happening, both at IT level, polytechnic level, and if I might add, at higher education and university level. So there is a lot more emphasis on workplace skills, workplace attachments, and this is already being put in place. To me, the way I see it is changes in ranking within a set of countries doesn't really bother me or matter to me. It is the absolute value change that I would be concerned about, and that is more important. So regarding the drop in literacy ranking and value, as I mentioned, our bilingual policy, where students have to learn English as well as mother tongue, at least up to grade 10, and also higher mother tongue at grade 12, grade 11 and 12. So this may not be so in other countries against which Singapore is being ranked and compared. So this surely must have an impact, I think, on the acquisition of competencies in language. Because when you're trying to learn 2 languages at quite a high level of competency, your English competency or your Mandarin competency or your Malay competency, etc., would be affected both ways. So the question is, how true is it? How far is it true that tracked systems are often associated with skills inequalities? So if Singapore has less than the expected inequality, then this is probably a good thing, because Singapore has shown that it doesn't mean that tracked systems would lead to skills inequality, more skills inequalities, because we have shown that it doesn't have to be the case. Let me also say that within the school system up to grade 10, Singapore's tracks are not vocational. Even the normal technical stream is not a vocational track, even though there's some opportunity to experience some technology, for example, like robots and mechatronics and so on. But it's only when they go to ITE and polytechnics that you might call it a tracked system. And how they teach mathematics there is very job function specific. The level of communication skills, writing skills, and speaking skills is tailored to the requirements of the diploma or certificate that they are pursuing. So it's very workplace driven. So it's not literacy in the sense that the junior college students, for example, would do. I'm particularly, I think that the rating of 1 given to the Singapore system, I think it probably could be rated at least a 2 rather than a 1 in my opinion. So in the taxonomy of post-secondary education systems, a number of hypotheses are made regarding the correlation of system types, skill levels, etc., curriculum standardization. So as I mentioned, these are reduced to numeracy and literacy and not necessarily work-based skills. So there's quite a number of things that I think, but let me just conclude by saying that culture, the colonial history of different countries, the post-colonial governance models and economic structures, our responses to technological development, I believe that these play a greater part than the different educational system types. So many of these models have been inherited over many generations, and it is a brave government that would change them radically.
Thank you very much, Dr. Varaprasad, for your very wide range of views on the presentation. Before we address anything, could I invite our next discussant, Professor Deng Zongyi, who is Professor in Curriculum and Pedagogy at the Institute of Education, University College London, to also give his views. Professor Deng, please.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay. Thank you for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here. Let me share with you my general reactions. So I'm a Singaporean, right? As a Singaporean, it was quite delighting to see the evidence of seeming success of the Singapore system in maintaining the balance between skill required in the economy and skill supply by the school, polytechnics, and ITE. But on the other hand, I was surprised to learn that Singapore have lesser unequal skill outcomes than expected. But what I'm going to do is, I will provide a very brief historical perspectives that I hope can shed light on the factors contributing to Singapore's success in maintaining the balance. I also want to raise some questions about equality in skill outcomes. Let me start with my historical perspective. Now, let's put aside PISA and TIM and other measurements. I will try to argue that, Singapore education system is a success in its own sense, right? Because now there's an observation argument from my mentor and colleague, I think he's in the audience, Professor Kobe. In one of the most dramatic turnarounds in the contemporary post-colonial history, an ethnically divided, small, impoverished state became a much sought after model for order, effectiveness, efficiency, progressive development, right? Now, Singapore's success. Actually, the Singapore success story also dubbed by the OECD, right? It's all about the Asia success story of Singapore. Now, the country transformed itself from a fishing village to a modern industry economy over 4 decades. So I think behind the transformation, right, is the central role played by school education. Now, education has been a vehicle for social cohesion. Education also mean for economic development and reconstruction. Education also for nation building, I think it's quite remarkable. It's based upon my understanding about the Western literature in the West. There have been always sometimes very fashionable to describe the significance of schooling in the West. Indeed, people have been skeptical about the role, the function school can play in school and civic functions, right? There are no such doubt in Singapore. Why Singapore is a testimony, is a case. The historical perspective and empirical evidence can attest or testify the importance of the contribution of education to economy, development, to nation building, etc., etc. Now, I might try to briefly highlight some key policies the government implemented over the past 40 years. Some key policy, right? I think that there's a bilingual policy that speak for the equality treatment of official languages.
Em mới nghe tên đèn pha.
Can you hear me?
May I ask for everyone to mute yourself if you're
Okay.
while the presentation is going on? Thank you.
Now, basically, you call it equal treatment for languages. So you have English, Chinese, Malay, and Tamil. On the one hand, there's a commitment to equality, all right? Equality. On the other hand, all right, there's a recognition of the necessity and the value of English as an international language. Now, the mastering of English would provide social and individual advantage, which have contributed significantly to Singapore socio-economic modernization. So this actually are political linguistic settlement, right, that have stood the test of the time. There's a bilingual policy, the equality treatment for official languages. Now, I think you also mentioned there's a standardization of curriculum, or the uniform. There's a uniform and common curriculum, all right, and there's a strong emphasis on mathematics, science, and technical subjects. Also emphasize civics and citizenship education. And Singapore achieved universal free primary education in the late 70s. There's only 3 key policies, right, implemented from 56 to 78. Let's continue. And tracking, streaming was implemented in 1980, right? In the primary school at that time, you have EM1, EM2, EM3, and then secondary school, special, express, and normal. Right? I'm not going to elaborate. So there's a streaming policy. And curriculum standardization, as the report have pointed out, or is a key factor. Curriculum standardization, all right. The national, all right, in the 1980, the Curriculum Development Institute of Singapore established, responsible for all the syllabuses and instructional guides and textbook developing. All right. Now, I think that's quite. Also, you point out the prevalence of technical vocational education that was established in the 1990s. All right. The ITE established in 1990 to provide technical and vocational training for school graduates. And Polytechnic established in 1955 to train middle level professionals, engineers, for example. All right. So basically, a national education system has been in place geared to the needs of an industrializing economy, right? In which, in this system, a very large proportion of students, all right, involved in polytechnics rather than in university. That's a very important feature. Okay, now from these key policies, I think I can tease out some feature, all right, defining feature of the Singapore modern education system. So first of all, there's a national curriculum, so the national system with a modern curriculum comprised by mathematics, sciences, and technical subjects, civic and moral education, curriculum standardization. Now, as you pointed out, right, that's really the Taiwan upper secondary education and training system, quite obvious, according to your report. The prevalence of vocational education training. Now, very importantly, English knowing bilingualism. All right, the Singaporean students are very high, right, in English, or right, they're highly proficient in English. The basic, also be a basic command of the mother tongue, a very high English proficiency. And early trimming, right, tracking, certainly also their development and modification, all right, modification. So Now, our exam-based meritocracy with a premium on examination success. So they have O-level, A-level, also PSLE, or like the examination of O-level, A-level, right, by Cambridge assessment. So examination result determine the kind of school you will attend, also the kind of job student will do, and also the future financial rewards. So basically, so I then really highlight some key contributing factor to Singapore PISA success. All right, their commitment to high academic standards, rigorous standards have lifted the floor for all groups, right? Chinese, Malay, Tamil, etc. Right at the very beginning and throughout the school years, as based upon made by Professor Gopilalan. There are also strong emphasis on student math and science competency, and also English speaking bilingual proficiency. Basically, it's a very high quality, high expectation system. There are no excuse for every group, right? Chinese, Malay, or Tamil, no excuse. Every group, every individual have to perform and meet the basic expectation and standards. So that might somehow, I will argue, why there's some key contributing factor to Singapore PISA success. And lastly, I have some question, right? I have some question, as I mentioned at the beginning, about the finding, or according to the report, Singapore have rather less unequal skill outcomes than might be expected. But according to Kaye candidate, I think he also looked at PISA and TIM data, did analysis by some years ago. Here are the finding, right? Now, Singapore have high mean achievement scores in mathematics, science, but also very long tail, right, to the achievement distribution. So basically, the SES, social economic status, seem to have a significant impact on reading achievement. Now, one unit increase in SES is associated with a 7 score point difference in Singapore. Now, compared to Hong Kong, only 17, Shanghai only 27, and Finland 31. Now, in Singapore, according to the finding, no SES student do succeed in Singapore, but to a lesser extent compared with in Hong Kong, then Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Finland. So maybe just a question, right? Because this is such a question. As I mentioned at the beginning, I was surprised to learn about Singapore have lesser unequal skill outcomes than expected. Because here just another and a counter finding. I don't know why. Just so there's a put a question mark. I think that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Deng. May I turn now to perhaps Dr. Neil and Dr. Hao, would you like to make some comments in reaction to the discussants, please? And since we don't have very much time remaining, perhaps you'd like to, kind of take on the reactions and the questions kind of together. Yeah.
Yes, I'll try and be as brief as possible, and I'll have to defer to Hao on some of the very more Singapore specific comments. Firstly, I'd like to thank both of the discussants for your robust critique for the research, and to Dr. Varaprasad. To say firstly that actually I'm coming from the opposite side to you, because I come with experience of educational research and less experience in, let's say, in terms of a labour market affects economics. So my perspective may be slightly different to yours. I've scribbled a load of notes, and in the interest of kind of brevity, I'm just going to pick out a few comments on as a reply to your reply, as it were. And I think a lot of the points you made are really really relevant. But unfortunately, this is almost to some extent the nature of undertaking this kind of cross-national secondary data analysis, if you like. So you are to some extent reliant on secondary data that's been collected, by the OECD, by UNESCO, other institutions, and which has been kind of it's been made comparable to some extent, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're comparing like for like in every system in every country. And of course, this does kind of you are to some extent beholden to the data that's available. And when you talk about, yes, literacy and numeracy, these are very broad concepts, and they are measured very differently in different contexts, let's say. And actually what may be more important, in terms of the labor market, might not be these broad concepts of literacy and numeracy, but skills and tasks which are more context specific. And so, of course, we would love to be able to have data on drilling down on a whole host of different, more specific skills, but actually the data just doesn't exist, shall we say, or to that extent that we can do this kind of analysis on such a wide sample of countries. I thought the point that you made in terms of what's driving what, in terms of, are these skills inequalities being driven by income inequality, or is that the outcome? And of course, it's very difficult to disentangle causality here, and it may be impossible. In fact, it may be, as you say, a vicious circle of one driving the other. But you're certainly right to point out that this is something which deserves further investigation. Just a couple of other points, bearing in mind the time. You talk about, of course, this analysis is retrospective to some extent. We're looking backwards. That's again the nature of this kind of analysis. So you talk about what's the relevance of today's labor market and even tomorrow's labor market. Well, of course, yes, that's again the nature of this kind of analysis. But at the same time, I think it also lends kind of credibility to the use of looking at skills such as literacy and numeracy, even as they are broadly defined. But these are still likely to be key, essential, very basic but essential skills, sine qua non skills that workers coming into the labor market, whether or not it's a labor market which is more automated or a labor market which is more computer focused or etc. I think literacy and numeracy underpin a lot of these skills. So it's relevant to focus on these if you're looking to the future, an uncertain future. You don't know what the future is, but at a very minimum, you would expect that literacy and numeracy will be key skills. And as to kind of drilling down, we would also have liked to have done a bit more kind of qualitative work to unpick some of these individual skills. That's where the added value of looking at specific contextual skills may lie. But you can really only unpick that through very highly contextualized and highly kind of qualitative analysis. And this also kind of goes back to your other point in respect to the cultural historical aspects of education systems. And again, this is in response to Professor Deng's presentation. In a way, every single education system is unique. It organically grows out of the cultural and historical context from which it comes. But does this it goes to the very heart of whether or not this type of cross-national analysis can actually be done? Does it have any meaning? Is it relevant? every education system is unique to some extent. And yet there are still concerted efforts and lots of money and lots of time and resources put into organizations like the OECD, other labor market institutions, the EU, to undertaking this research on a cross-national level. So obviously these people think these institutions think that there is benefit to doing these kind of cross-national comparisons. Where does the value lie? Well, it's looking at seeing what can be learnt cross-nationally if something's not specifically universal, but at least there are elements of some policy here or some policy there, which might be applied within a different context. So, even though we're kind of limited by the data that we have available and the concepts that are used in order, if you like, to make that data cross-nationally comparable, I think it's still worth spending time and resources and looking at what these data are saying, so that we can find some kind of policy responses or answers that may be applicable cross nationally. I'm going to pass over to Hao, see if she has anything to add specifically on the Singapore case.
Thank you very much, Neil. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. I think first I had to say that I didn't have chance to conduct my fieldwork in Singapore as I expected because of the pandemic, and it's put a lot of limits on the data we have qualitatively. That's why I have to explain in my presentations that there's certain indicator we can't quantify, but it's very important to bring in to explain why Singapore is doing so well. And I'm guessing my presentation is not about the factors that contribute to the high average score of Singaporean students and the inequalities in skills, but it's more like an add-on sections to our cross-country analysis. So I think the approach is actually the opposite, like what you've been expecting. So we had that finding from the cross-countries analysis, and we tried to link it with the case of Singapore to see which one is relevant and which one is not. And in fact, we found the two policy recommendations that we propose in our presentation is actually linked to, I'm guessing that the new finding from our cross-country analysis about the curriculum standardizations in Singapore and the provisions of apprenticeships in Singapore. So I'm not saying that this is the best solutions to mitigate inequalities of skills in Singapore, but this is the pathway, the possible pathway that Singapore could take if Singapore would like to reduce the inequality in core skill. We have to emphasize here that it is about core skill, because that's what our data allow us to do analysis. And I'm very much appreciate your comments about the bilingual policies. When I read about this, I also have some reservations, and because it's very hard to to just talk about both English and national language at the same time, because I know in Singapore students have to do both mother tongue and English. But what we trying to do here is just to focus on English, because that's the language that is used in upper secondary school, upper secondary level, and it's also the language that they use in certain survey. So yeah, I mean, I'm aware that there's a specific features of Singapore there. Also the cultures and the streaming, the checking system, and the pedagogies and the standardizations in the way policy making is working in Singapore. But yeah, it's just mean that we couldn't do any qualitative study in Singapore. We couldn't do any interviews or school like classroom observation in Singapore. That's why there's certain limitation in our data, and we have to make the most of what we have. If it makes sense.
Right.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Hao. Thank you very much, Neil. And actually, on behalf of the Institute for Adult Learning, I'd like to wrap up this session. I'd like to thank very much Professor Francis Green, Dr. Gok Sun Ju, Dr. Neil Kaye, Dr. Phan, Dr. Varaprasad, and Professor Deng Zongyi for gracing our event with their presence and with their presentations and with the very invigorating discussions. Most of all, I'd like to thank all of you in the audience for staying with us through the 3 hours or so. Here at the Institute for Adult Learning, we very much look forward to the possibility and the promise of continued collaborative research and other projects. So please, let's look forward to the next possibility. Thank you, everyone. Do have a very good afternoon in the UK, a very good evening in Singapore and here in Asia. And we look forward to the next opportunity to meet, hopefully in person, when this pandemic is well and over. Yes, Professor Francis Green, would you like to say anything, please?
I'd just like to thank you as well for leading us through and Johnny also for leading us through a long and I think quite intense session. And just to say that we've learned from the discussion. Thank you very much. And we will definitely be able to incorporate some of the comments where we should be revising our report, and the report itself will be delivered to the Institute of Education, Institute of Adult Learning in a few weeks' time. And that will add to the sort of available outcomes eventually for people to learn more about this project. So thank you so much. It's been a wonderful occasion for us. As I said at the beginning, it's the culmination of a two and a half, I forget exactly how long, a project extended because of the pandemic. We've had some difficult times, but it's been worthwhile, I think. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone. Yes, do see you we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.